Okay, guys, welcome back to part two of the top 105 cards in Dune Imperium. We left off at Show of Strength at number 90. Really cool card, actually. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the 80s here. And yeah, let's go ahead and start with Weirding Way. So I have Weirding Way down at 89, and that's probably going to be a little controversial. People tend to really like this card. I think the idea of extra turn effects has a very high pedigree, especially from Magic the Gathering. But the really interesting thing about this card is that it illustrates the difference between Dune Imperium and Magic the Gathering. And that in the Magic, this card would be insanely powerful. But in Dune, it's not really all that powerful. The reason is the turn in this game still is fundamentally limited by the round structure of the game. And by taking an extra turn, you're still using another agent, or you're revealing. You're costing yourself tempo in a weird way. So if you use this card, what you're gonna have happen is that you're going to find that you end up out of actions before everybody else, and then other players are going to respond to the fact that you're tapped out. Using another Magic analogy here, and then they're going to use that to take advantage of your board position. So, yeah, you can take all your actions, but then they're going to respond to what you do. And they're going to know exactly how many daggers you have in the combat and everything like that. So, this is kind of the inverse of the Mentat, where one of the reasons I like the Mentat is that it gives you the ability to react to what your opponents do. This is the opposite. This forces your opponents to react to you. And if you're in a dominant position, that can be a good thing because maybe they can't react to you. But if they can, well, it's a problem. Um, but this card's not all downside. It can help you put together board space combos. So, for example, you were going to go. It's round 7, and you have 4 spice, and uh, Ariana has 6 spice, and she's going to go to Highliner on her turn. Well, you can go Weirding Way to hog a basin and then immediately hit Highliner before you even give her a chance to react. Or you can go grab water and hit Research Station. Or you can, I'm not going to list every single combo you could possibly do, but the point is, this does open up some pretty cool plays. The thing that I think sees the most consistent play with is, play this card. It doesn't have a Bene Gesserit tribal effect, and then play a Bene Gesserit tribal effect second immediately afterwards. Particularly if that is restricted on where it can go. So play Reverend Mother Mahayam would be the classic example. And Reverend Mother Mahayam is particularly good because she's better the earlier in the round you can get her off. If you get Reverend Mother Mahayam off on your third action, well, some of the players may already be revealing by then. And at that point, a revealed player isn't damaged by that effect at all. So being able to move that up in the turn is an interesting way of causing maximum damage. So Weirding Way is good as a combo card with other cards, Bene Gesserit in particular, but there's other cards that you can do this with. Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, but I don't think it's good. The card on its own, if you're not pulling off some kind of combo, is not amazing, right? It's a scout basically that has an extra dagger attached, and you already know what I think of scout, so an extra dagger makes it a little better, but not a lot better. The Bene Gesserit tag is really important though, and that's one reason why this card slips in at 89 and doesn't end up lower, because I do think that there's a lot of really interesting ways to use this. If you guys have any stories of really powerful Weirding Way plays that you've made, let me know. I'd be interested in hearing about them. I've seen it happen once or twice, but in general, I still am not sold on this card. Okay, next is Blank Slate. And honestly, I haven't seen this card played one way or another ever. And that's just because most of my games recently have been on digital, which doesn't have immortality. But the other reason is just that this is a low-cost card that I think everybody thinks is bad. And I'm not convinced that it's as awful as people say. To go over it, that is a baseline, right? If you don't graft this, it's a blank signet ring. That's what it is. It's a blank signet ring, which is not a good card, but it's not an awful card. I'd rather have a blank signet ring over a, many of the cards in the back 5 or 10 on this list. Um, the access is fine, even if you don't graft it. The reveal is a little bit below average, but not awful. If you do graft it, having access to factions is kind of nice. Now, you may look at that and say, well, if the upside is just having a fold space, basically, then what's the point of the card? And what I would say the point of the card is that it allows you to take other cards that have graft on them that are restrictive in where they can go to anywhere. So this is not just, granting access for your action, it's also granting access for your other graft card. So Guild Impersonator is a great example. You can use this to take Guild Impersonator to a desert space. You can use it to take Guild Impersonator to a city space, although that's going to less frequently be useful. And there's other graft cards that work well with this. The one that infiltrates any space. If you play that with the blank slate, well, guess what? Now you can infiltrate literally anything. So the problem with this card, and the reason why it's at 88, and I've done a lot of defending of it, but ultimately I do have it in the bottom quarter of cards, is that it's inherently going to be card disadvantage. So when you play this card grafted to another card, unless the card you're grafting to provides, card draw in some way, what's going to end up happening is that you just hurt your reveal, basically. You end up running out of your own resources. If you have a high council seat, that's not so bad, but if you have a high council seat, you're probably already in a good position anyway. Yeah, so this is good with cards that give faction bumps as well, because you can use them to double up on a faction. But yeah, there you go. So, I don't love this card, but I would consider picking it up early, especially if I'm trying to build a graft-based strategy. I think you need to have the graft card first, and then pick up blank slate later. It's my opinion on that one. Okay. Next is Chris Knife. I might have this card a little bit too high, but in Imperium Digital, I've been pleasantly surprised by this card. It's not a good card, but I had heard about it from the Hidden Assets podcast. They were talking about how bad it is, and it's not great, but I don't think their reasoning stands up. And the reason is, there's a couple things this card has going for it. The first is it's got a Fremen tag. So it triggers Fremen Bond, and it has Fremen Bond. The fact that it gives Solari on action is not amazing. That's about the weakest possible agent box you could have, just about. So it's not a great agent box, but it's something. And sometimes the game comes down to one Solari. Sometimes you're one Solari away from your Swordmaster or your Mentat or whatever, and that does end up mattering. The Fremen access is also quite good. Being able to access Fremen and also get something out of it is very nice. And then the yellow access is not bad either. But I think really what I've noticed is that this card makes it really hard for players to stop you from taking the Fremen Alliance. All you need is this plus a better Fremen card. Could be a Liaison, which is always available. And you're just going to be constantly revealing for Fremen bumps. That's going to catch people off guard, and that's going to help you lock in that alliance. Now, I do have a sort of a side note over here that I think this card is pretty good for Yuna. If you play this card as Yuna to a space, anywhere actually, you'll get 2 Solari. Now think about this. If you play this to smuggling as Yuna, you'll get 2 Solari from the knife, 2 Solari from the space. So you're getting 4 Solari, already a ton. And then if you cash out on the shipping track, you'll get another 6. So you're talking about potentially 10 Solari. It's quite valuable for her. And it's not a terrible card in any Fremen-based deck. So, again, don't get me wrong, the card's not good. It doesn't have Persuasion. That's really the main thing that this card has against it. The other thing people say is that it costs 3 Persuasion. That's true. I think this card probably would be better costed at 2 Persuasion. But if you're revealing for 3 and there's not a better card available, then there's nothing wrong with this. Again, don't consider it a great card. Wouldn't rush for this ever. But in the right situation, it can do good work. Okay, high priority travel. I maybe have ended up ranking this a little higher than it deserves to be at, but I don't think it's too bad. The main rider on this card is that it wants you to have two influence at the guild, and then you get an interesting effect. So, two guild influence of all the factions, you could say, hey, we're gonna gate this card behind having a certain number of influence of the faction. The guild is the least restrictive faction that you could put that behind, because when you go to fold space, it gives you more guild access, so you're more likely to get to two. The other reason is just that everybody ends up getting to guild, or at least two or three players end up getting to guild every single game. There's never a game where you end up in round four and nobody has any guild access. It's just, or no guild influence. It just doesn't happen. So the ask here is not super hard to meet. And a good chunk, 60-70% of your games, you'll have already met this condition once you see this card in the Imperium row. So we're not thinking too much about the condition. Now, draw a card is not terrible. It's not good, but it's not bad. I really enjoy drawing cards. I think it's great. And yellow spaces never draw you cards, so being able to draw on yellow is pretty good. Drawing on the shipping track on spice spaces is something that is not bad to have. And then the thing that really makes this card unique is that it has daggers on it. So it lets you deploy to spaces that normally wouldn't let you deploy. So go to Dreadnought, immediately deploy the Dreadnought. Go to Emperor if you graph this. Deploy your troops from Emperor. It allows you to deploy troops that you get from the spacing guild track, the shipping track. So even if you don't have troop transports, right, you can still deploy those troops from the shipping track. It's just a really interesting card. It lets you spin your wheels, go to Mentat, deploy troops. That's one of the downsides of Mentat, is it typically puts you behind in the combat, because while you're going to Mentat, other players are taking the city spaces. They're taking the hardy warriors and stuff, and then you have better actions, but by the time that you take all your actions, you might not be able to get enough troops in the combat to get to where you need to go. So deploying troops on the combat is also pretty good sometimes. So I think this is a really interesting decision point. And then the reveal for a Solari, I don't think Solari is amazing on reveal, but as long as a card also has persuasion on it, I'm not going to complain. Obviously, the same thing I said about Chris Knife applies for this card as with Yuna, right? Reveal it for 2 Solari, not bad. And again, you don't feel like, unlike Assassination Mission, you don't feel like this card is really hurting you because it does have persuasion on it. Now, 1 persuasion is not good, but it's not bad either. It's not like horrible, which is, if we go back here, like, this is really bad, not having any persuasion at all, and sort of similar. So yeah, I think this card's interesting. I need to play with it a little bit more. That's going to be a theme for the Immortality cards, where I've played maybe 20, 30 games with them. Not with the cards themselves, but with the set, with the game in general. And so a lot of them I don't have a ton of experience with, but generally speaking, I can speak on, the way that the expansion works. And some of them I have direct experience with. So this one is one that I like, but ultimately it's a 1-cost card, and I think its value reflects that. Okay, 85, Shut Out Mapes. Mapes is kind of a cool card. And I think, starting at 85 here, or starting even at 90 we had earlier, we're starting to get into some pretty interesting cards. I think the most interesting cards lie kind of in that 90 to, we'll say 20 zone, where you get cards that, sometimes you want them and sometimes you don't, and you have to think about, when do I get this? When do I sacrifice my card draw for this? When do I focus on getting onboard objectives? That's where I think the meat of this list is going to be the most interesting, because when you see the number 2 card or number 3 card, you're like, yeah, obviously I beeline that. And when you see, your Scout and your Sauerkraut Legion, you're like, obviously I avoid that like the Plague. So those cards are less interesting. I think these get better. But anyway, Shut Out Mapes, I quite like her. Just like many of the Fremen, she accesses Desert and Fremen. That's very common, same as Chris Knife. But the cool thing about Mapes is, and the bottom half is nothing special either, right? 1 persuasion, whatever, dagger, whatever. You may deploy or retreat one of your troops. That's interesting because, retreating troops on reveal is pretty bog standard. If that were all it was, you could just retreat a troop. This would be better than scout, but not by like a ton. Accessing faction is always great, but retreating a troop is not that useful. But it lets you deploy a troop, and deploying in the reveal phase is fantastic because players will go into that reveal phase thinking, okay, this player is not in the combat. They can't contribute at all. I can get in and sneak a third place, or, they only have this much or that much. And then Mapes comes in and she gives you an instant 3 strength. She gives you 1 from herself and 2 from the troop that you put in. And I think that's really cool. There's a card higher on this list that does this but a little bit better. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think it's fundamentally a really cool effect. There's also on this card, one of the advantages is you can deploy or retreat, and then the retreat's not nothing. Like sometimes you genuinely will want to retreat troops. It's an effect that I really like, and I like the elements of the game that focus on it. Like I was a big fan of Amber Matuli. I know that everybody hates her, but I found her super fun. Chani in the new expansion, Bloodlines, is looking really interesting. And this card is interesting too. So I would pick this up fairly frequently. I don't think it's a great card. Like if I'm playing Armand or Helena, I probably won't pick this up a ton just because it's going to lower the quality of my deck. But in a deck where I'm not doing a ton of deck building and I'm just basically getting a giant pile of cards, yeah, this card definitely fits the bill. Not amazing, but not terrible either. Okay. Arrakis Liaison. So Liaison is, I think, one of the most interesting cards in the game to talk about, actually. And I'll sort of explain why here. So Liaison, I think when you first start the game, if you come from like Dominion and other deck builders of that nature, you look at Liaison and you say, well, why would I want this? This has no agent box, right? It doesn't go to any factions. Its reveal is nothing special. This is like a blank card. Like why would I get this? And as you play more into the game, you realize that this card is not as bad as it seems. When I started playing digital, one thing I noticed was that Arrakis Liaisons are very frequently the correct purchase, early and late, because they're not actually a bad card. Accessing green and blue is useful for a lot of leaders. I have Ilbon pictured here, where Ilbon consistently wants to be able to access green, and he also wants as much persuasion as he can get. And Liaison fits the bill for that. And the reason that Liaison's not a bad card, it's not 10 spots lower in the 90s or in the hundreds, is because 2 persuasion is higher than average. The average Dune Imperium card probably has, if I had to guess, like 1.6 persuasion on it, or 1.4 persuasion on it, something like that, in that ballpark. So having the 2 is considerably above average. And if if you're drawing enough cards that you're able to make 3 or maybe 4 agent boxes around 2 satisfactory spaces, the fact that there's no agent box on this card doesn't matter, right? It's actually improving your deck by being better than average. So I do kind of like this card. I don't love this card, but it does something important. And the situation where you're caught with your double dagger opening hand in round 1 and you end up revealing, a Liaison is frequently the correct purchase, because getting that persuasion for rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 will help you build your deck into where you need it to be. It'll help you get to your Piter de Vries, your Lady Jessica, your Kwisatz even. And I think that's also important. Like when you see those high octane cards in the row, you usually want to pick up 1 Liaison so that you can try to draw into it in rounds 2 and 3 to get your strategy started. Now, I'll talk also, the access is not fantastic, but it's not bad either. Picking this up helps prevent you from getting locked out of Swordmaster, and cities are going to be valuable all game long. The thing about this card also is it's Fremen, so it works great with your Fremen Bond type stuff. I have Liet Kynes here as sort of a pictured image that's making this point, but there's a lot of other cards in that ballpark. If you have a Shai Hulud, if you have a Fatakin Death Commando, Sayadina, like This card always being available means that you can always kind of turn on Fremen Bond if you have to. And because Fremen Bond is a reveal focused strategy, that frequently pays you off. Now, I have Kynes here in particular because for Kynes, the way that this card works is 2 persuasion for each Fremen card you have in play. That's cards that you play with agent icons, that's cards that you revealed, that's Kynes herself. So, the nice thing about this card, people frequently, actually, and I've seen it win games, I've actually done this before with Armandi Kaz, will pick up Liet Kynes, and then from there on out, they buy as many liaisons as they possibly can so that they can reveal for like 18 persuasion and pick up multiple Spice Mist flows. And that can be its own little, self-contained win condition, which I think is really cool. Now, I did this on Armand, and the way that I did it on Armand was that I used his ring to pick up more Fremen cards, cheap Fremen cards and liaisons, and then I would use his coordination ability to trash all my non-Fremen cards. That way, I was drawing Kynes more consistently, and then when I did draw Kynes, I would also have fewer non-Fremen cards for her to key off of. So I think this is an interesting card. I don't think it's a good card necessarily. Like, I think most 2-cost cards in the row are going to be better. I say most, and the ones that are below it on this list are the ones that aren't. The voice is better, for example. If you can get a solid agent box, that would be better. But this is nice to have for the game as like you're struggling on persuasion. Here's a way to get back towards your Spice Must flows. And here's a way to get, other good cards in the row because you didn't get a good one this time. So I really like how this is sort of an inherent boomerang effect. And in the late game, you pick these up frequently just because you're like, well, none of these other cards are likely to show up in my deck again, but I need a Spice Mist flow, and I might as well buy as much persuasion as I can. And Liaison's the place where you find that. So, interesting card for sure. Okay, Desert Ambush. I don't have a ton of experience with this card. I don't really like it very much, but I have seen players do really good things with it, and I have to put some respect on its name. So, if you look at the card itself, just the reveal and the access, it's not very good. This chassis on its own, even with the Fremen tag, is probably, not worth 3 persuasion. But the agent effect is really interesting. And I think it got better with Immortality. Because this is the only effect in the game, besides an intrigue card that we have, that will forcibly retreat your opponent's dreadnoughts. You can take people out of the combat entirely. You can deny them rewards. You get to choose each of the troops. So you choose who you're fighting. It's a very political tool. Now, the problem with this card is that these desert spaces don't give you troops. So if you take this to shipping, or if you take this to even deployment spaces like the spice spaces, the maker spaces, you're not going to get more than 2 troops in most of the time. Now, if you've got training drones, this gets really good. If you have graft, I think this gets really good. Because if you graft this to a highliner, well, you just won the combat. I mean, nobody's going to be able to stand up to that. You can completely dominate things, right? Same thing, graft it to hardy warriors. You get the same result. If you get a flagship with this card, oh my lord, right? Moving out at least 3 troops and maybe 5 every single time you play this card, if you have the supply to use it, it's really, really powerful. So I want to put some respect on this card, even though it's not my personal favorite. I have a friend who has used it to great effect, and I want to sort of, again, 83 is not good, don't get me wrong, it's not a good spot on the list, but I think this card is better than a lot of stuff that precedes it for that reason. I need to take a drink. This is like a lot of talking. Sorry. Okay. Missionaria Protectiva. This card is kind of weird. It's a 1-coster, which normally would signal that a card's bad. It's fantastic if you get the BG deck going, and horrible in every other situation. And I think you don't pick this card up unless you have another Bene Gesserit card first. Like get your other memories first. Get your Jessica first. Once you have those cards, then these become very valuable. And a faction up on a city space is nothing crazy by any means. But it can help you steal alliances. It's just good value. And I think in Immortality, the BG deck has gotten a lot easier to put together. So that's one of the things this card has going for it. Now I want to give special mention to Helena here because the problem with this card is that let's say first action you play Truesayer. Well, second action, if you don't have two Fremen influence and you don't have two water, which is very often the case, especially when you're deck building for Bene Gesserit, Carthag and the Arakeen may already be taken. And the benefit that Helena brings to this card is, hey, you can always play it, right? You're never going to be locked out of cities. You can always infiltrate a city and get this effect. So that's one thing I like about this card. There's definitely stronger payoffs for the BG deck, but this is a low cost one and it's easy to get it in play, and there's many of them. So if you're just trying to get a critical mass of BG cards, this can contribute to that. Okay. So next is Corrupt Smuggler. This one is interesting. It's got an if grafted effect. When I was talking about Sauerkraut Quartermaster, I mentioned the issues that I have with if grafted effects. Mainly that I think you want to have the graft in your deck before you pick up the if grafted, just because you're not likely to put this together all the time. Like that's the basic issue. If you don't find a way to put this together, you're going to be kind of in a bad spot. The 2 spice is great, but you need to be able to make sure you can get it. Now, the access on this card is actually pretty good, and it works well with shipping-focused strategies where you can go to fold space with it, and then after that you can go to your Interstellar. I don't value cards with that particular aspect, and we're going to see some other Yellow Guild cards in the future that have this same issue. But the thing is about that is that the race to Interstellar shipping is decided fairly early, usually in the first 2 rounds. So picking up Corrupt Smuggler round 1 is probably not going to make a huge difference in that race. It can help, but it's not going to change the fact. Like if you're 4th position and you don't get access to guild, well then you're probably just not going to be able to do this. But the if graft is not bad, and it's great with Guild Impersonator. Guild Impersonator is not a very expensive card, and if you graft it to Corrupt Smuggler, you can end up basically taking a power play to Guild, right? Put this on Guild, gain the spice, go up with Guild for gaining spice. You're on Guild anyway, so you already gain 1. Not bad. The other interesting thing about this card is that this is another card in the cycle of mix and match factions. So this is the Guild Fremen card, trying to find some sort of overlap between those factions. Smuggling is a logical place to put that. There's not really very much guild payoff in Dune Imperium, Ix and Immortality, but there is Interstellar Conspiracy, and this card goes great with that. And the Fremen, it does trigger your Fremen bond, so it's not terrible for that either. This card could go lower on the list. I need a little bit more experience playing with it, but I think it has some combo potential, and I'm interested to see how that turns out. Okay, Freighter Fleet. So Freighter Fleet is kind of I'll call it like the bog standard unload card. This card really wants you to unload it because it doesn't do anything else. No persuasion, no agent box, only goes to one type of space. Yes, that space is yellow, so it's inherently synergistic with the fact that you're going to be shipping a lot, but if you're sending the Freighter Fleet as an agent action to smuggling or Interstellar, I feel like you're already in a bad spot. Like, what this card wants you to do is reveal it, you know, discard it, trash it, do all of those unload things, use a Truthsayer on it, use a Hollow Projectors on it, and then it can really be pretty good. Now, the floor for this card's not awful because shipping bumps are pretty decent, but I still don't like picking it up aggressively unless I kind of know what I like, what I'm going to do with it. Now, the two leaders I have called out on this one, Armand and Hundro, we can basically copy paste Armand on every unload card from here on out because his ability to reveal a card, get the reveal aspect of the unload, and then immediately trash it with coordination and get the same effect again is very powerful. And in that case, for Armand, like if you reveal Freighter Fleet, trash Freighter Fleet, you just got an interstellar shipping. Yeah, it's not during the agent action phase, still very, very powerful. And then Hundro here, Hundro just ships a lot. That's all there really is to it, is he just ships a lot. And having just more shipping in your extremely shipping focused deck is solid. Very solid. If he finds ways to repeatedly unload this, it's going to get ugly. So I think this card's pretty decent. It's just not a priority for me. It's not. It gets worse the less you're able to go to the shipping track, and I tend not to go to the shipping track as much as I could. I try to let other players fight for that objective and do my own thing in my own lane. Okay, so I had somebody on the last video ask about experimentation. Well, it's not what he asked. He asked about Dune the Desert Planet, but this is, I guess we can say this is a record of how much did Immortality improve Dune the Desert Planet, because the answer is taking it from 104 to 79. That's a pretty big jump. That's almost 30 spots up. And all that really changed is give it an agent box and give it a reveal effect. It's not a crazy good agent box by any means, and it's not a crazy reveal effect either. But it's really, really nice and really, really helpful. This card it's weird. It changes the balance of the game, because it used to be that the Dunes were these cards that you wanted to get rid of, but experimentations are the opposite. You really want to keep them in your deck, quite for a long time, at least is until you know exactly how many points you're getting from the Scarab track, because both sides of this card contribute to the Scarab track in one way or another, either through reclaimed forces on the bottom half or through the generic research effects on the top half. And if you say, okay, I'm going to get one Scarab point but not two, okay, then at that point you can trash this card. That's kind of how I feel about it. I think it's pretty good with the effects, and that really changes the balance of the game, and also the balance of a leader like Armand, when you took cards that were bad and then you made them into top 80 cards. So one interesting little tidbit about experimentation, I suppose. Okay, Jessica of Arrakis. So this card is actually very, very similar to the card we left off on last time, which was, I believe, Show of Power, right? Show of Strength, sorry. These are the same cards, except Show of Strength can't go anywhere on its own without meeting a certain condition, and Jessica of Arrakis can. The tags are different, and Jessica of Arrakis, instead of basically requiring graft and or a combat focused lead, instead what she asks you is, hey, if you want to get the BG deck going, I'll give you 2 cards. Sweet, that's a research station, man. That's a selective breeding. I appreciate that. Now, I still have this at 78 because I generally would still avoid this card. I think that it's not a starter for the deck itself, and you're going to end up in this situation where you have Jessica in your hand, but you don't have your other BG card in hand, and you just need to draw cards to get to your other BG card, but you can't do it because you don't have the BG online, so you can't use Jessica. I think that's really the downfall of this card. It's fine, and when the deck works, this is a great card. right? When the deck works, this is basically the same thing as Lady Jessica, right? Draw two on play with more restricted access. Um, but hey, this card is significantly lower than Lady Jessica. And I think, as I'm sort of thinking about it, this card may need to drop a few places in the list. But that's where I have it. I value the BG deck quite a bit. I think it's quite powerful. And cards that enable and set that up are very valuable themselves. So there you go. Okay, 77, Fadekin Death Commando. I think this card could probably stand to go a little bit higher. It's really actually a very effective card. It's one of our lowest ranking trash cards. In fact, it may be our lowest ranking trash card. Trashing cards in this game is one of my absolute favorite things to do. But the honest fact of the matter is, you really don't have to do it. Like, Tessia can win this game with her starting deck and nothing else. And the same is partially true for the Baron. So trashing is cool and good when you have good stuff that you want to draw into more often, but it's not a mandatory effect. The access is okay, maybe a little bit below average, and then the reveal is very interesting because this is a Fremen card and a Fremen Bond card, and the Fremen Bond is pretty good. Like, 2 daggers I don't think that much of. 3 daggers we're starting to get into the point where this can swing you combats that people didn't expect you to have. I think this card also gets better the more of them you have. It sort of sets itself up too, because you can use this to trash your non-Fremen cards to draw into your Fremen cards more often, thereby making the effect happen more often. And unlike a lot of Fremen cards, this card does have Persuasion, so you're not like screwed if you don't get the Fremen Bond effect. So I like this card a fair bit. But I'm just being honest with myself here that I think that a lot of the trash cards have been fairly overrated, and that's going to be reflected in this ranking. I like it. I think it's great with the Fremen deck, but the Fremen deck doesn't come together that often in my experience, and that's one of the things pulling this card down. Okay, Bounty Hunter. So we see our next infiltrate a single type of space card. This one's pretty good, actually. And I really like this sort of rider on the agent box, which is something that we don't see a whole lot of. Like, if you use this card to infiltrate, which none of the other cards require of you, you get a benefit. And 2 Solari is not nothing. 2 Solari is pretty potent. This is good as a way of sort of getting your economy going in sort of the early mid-game. And it only costs 1 Persuasion, which I think is a big argument in this card's favor, that you can get this on almost nothing and use it to infiltrate research station, infiltrate Carthag and Arakeen. Now this card's not that good for Helena because she just doesn't need it, but for most leaders this is kind of nice to have around. And that being said, the fundamentals of the card aren't fantastic. Like, going to Only City is not amazing, and revealing for 1 Persuasion and 1 Dagger is not amazing. But this card is still very flexible. Like, you still are... Most rounds, you will benefit from going from at least one of the cities. Just that's the way it is. You're never going to be sorry to take this to Arakeen for the most part. So, I like this. This fixes your hands by always letting you go to Arakeen and draw cards, or even Research Station. Okay, last card of the video is going to be Ixian Engineer. Ixian Engineer is such a weird card. This card is the reverse of many of the cards in this game, where it, instead of being better the earlier you get it, the more you can play it, it actually ends up being worse the earlier you get it, and the better the later you get it. Now, it has something I like, which is that agent box, but the fact of the matter is, going only to the desert spaces and buying techs, it's not that good. You can use this with like invasion ships to do a surprise combat, and it does turn on the bottom half of the card, but this card is very clearly overcosted at 5. It's just not worth 5 points of persuasion. Now, the weird thing, though, is that if you can get the point out of the bottom half of this card, it is really good. And you're not going to know if you're in that universe until the mid or late game. And then this card becomes valuable and dangerous. I wouldn't pick this card up to deny it from somebody else, usually, unless that player was running away with the game. But it is something to consider, and sometimes this will put you over the threshold you need to win. So that's why this is 75, despite on its face being kind of a bad effect. I generally don't want to use this for the agent box, which is my problem with it. And the other problem I have with it is the reveal is just so bad if you don't hit the condition. 0 persuasion on reveal, you're going to be really sad that you bought this. Not even a dagger. Yeah. I mean, it's tough. So, like, this card has the same sort of weird tension that Spy Satellites has, where it hurts you the earlier you get it, but the later you get it, the more other players want to get to it. So you're almost playing this game of chicken with the other players of figuring out who's going to make their deck worse first in order to get points for the late game. It's kind of cool that way. Yeah, and some games you're not going to get to 3 tech. I would say most games you don't get to 3 tech, but sometimes you will. And I'm curious to see how this card will work with Bloodlines, because Bloodlines is going to, generally speaking, make tech seems like stronger. It's going to power creep it a little bit, and it's also going to make it more accessible. So I'm interested to see what happens with this card. But yeah, there you go. That's Mixed Engineer and the next 15 cards on the list. So thanks for listening, guys. These have started to go into the cards that have a lot of drawbacks and interesting effects and ups and downs and factors you have to consider. That's where the real meat of the list lies. But anyway, thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see you next time.